Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about how to rock an iPhone pic. And just to be clear, it doesn't have to be an iPhone. It can be an Android or any other phone that you have that has a camera on it, or any camera that you have in your possession for that matter. The rules we talk about today can apply to any equipment that you can use to take a photograph. Now let me introduce myself. My name is Carrie Viol, and for about 12 years I was a professional photographer. I had a very busy studio and I photographed every single day. But a few years ago, I realized it was time for me to change my career, and I did. But closing my studio did not mean that I gave up my love of photography. And so I kept taking pictures every day. I take and post pictures on my social media every single day, on my Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook. And people always ask me what equipment I'm carrying around with me to take these kinds of photographs. And I always tell them it's nothing fancy, it's just an iPhone 8. In fact, I don't have any special editing app or software on my phone, and I don't edit these outside of my phone. I don't edit them at all. The only thing is some of these have been cropped to squares, as you can see. But that's it. So you don't have to have any kind of knowledge of special editing software to compose a great photograph. And that's what we're talking about today, is how to compose a great photograph on your phone and how to photograph like a pro, even if you've never taken a class a day in your life. So we're going to start with what I think might be the easiest way to improve your photography. And in fact, I was kind of famous for this when I was a photographer. And that is just change your position. Now, when I was a photographer, I was always climbing on things. I was always in a tree or on a chair or on my belly. I was continually changing my position because I was always looking for that composition that had the most energy and the most interest. And so here's an example of that. I was out on a walk the other day and I saw this cute little dragonfly. And he's cute, this is fine, but this is an object, right? This is an object in a frame, and it's fine. It's centered, it's fine. But he was being very patient, and so I decided to get a little closer to him. So I got closer and I got on my belly, and this goes from being an object to a little character study. And you can see his little personality in his face. You can see the colors on him better. And this is literally just, I didn't change anything else about the camera except I just got on my belly and got closer to him. And this can apply to a lot of things. It's not just animals. It can be photographs of people. It can be photographs of landscapes, even food. For instance, here's two shots I did of a meal my husband made at the restaurant last week. So this is fine. You know, it's sort of properly exposed, but the food is falling out of the frame. It's not particularly appetizing. I wasn't happy with this at all. And so immediately I just moved slightly, and I moved the plate a little, and suddenly this becomes a much more appealing and appetizing dish. There's leading lines, there's nice composition, it fills the frame properly, and that is literally just from moving a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about one of the things we can learn to use that will instantly help you be more of a professional photographer, and that is utilizing the rule of thirds. Now, you probably have already heard of the rule of thirds, but just in case, let's go through this really quickly. The rule of thirds just states that every frame that you see can be dissected into 9 quadrants using these 4 lines. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And where you place your focal point in the frame is what will create the interest in a lot of times, what will create the interest in your photograph. So this focal point here is this little lily pad. Now it does look a little out of focus here because I was zoomed in on this. But we're going to look at 4 different ways that we could frame this and see which one creates the most interest. Now to me, this is the least successful of the ones we're going to look at today. It's kind of not, it's not in the middle of anything. It's just kind of hanging out. The focal point is just kind of hanging out near the quadrants, but not on them, not really in them. And this is just the least successful. And you can see over here in the small shot, it's not bad, but it's not great. And here is another example of not bad, but not great. Actually, this might be my least favorite. This is all up in this quadrant, but it doesn't have a lot of interest. It's a lot of empty dead space over here, but it's not balanced. It's not strong. Now here we have this guy, and he's right here in this quadrant. His focal point is right here, which is generally great, but we're not controlling the movement well because it's facing out of the frame, it's leading out of the frame in not a pleasing way. And so here's my favorite arrangement, and you can see over here. This arrangement works the best for me because it's following along these interesting quadrant lines, which of course you wouldn't see in the real photograph. But it's leading into the frame, and even the movement's leading into the center of the frame. So this creates a really interesting and pleasing composition. We'll look at one more example of that. So here's a photograph of this ice wall we happened to encounter last winter. And I just photographed this quickly, and I didn't even think about it very much. But then later I was looking at this photograph, and I thought, that's so interesting. I bet these quadrant lines are lining up pretty close to perfect. And sure enough, I just laid the quadrant lines over this photograph, and the entire ice wall pretty much falls into the left quadrant. Along this quadrant line, this other background focal point, the highest mountain, happens to hit almost dead center of this quadrant line here. And just one more little element, you may not have even noticed the car at first, but there is a car along this leading line of the road, and it happens to fall almost perfectly along this bottom quadrant line. And so the rule of thirds can really just help you create a pleasing image. You may not even know, you may not be able to put words to why it works, why it just has a nice energy, but if you can start utilizing the rule of thirds, you will instantly see your photographs working better. But working with that same kind of idea, that's controlling the movement. Oopsie, can't type controlling. So in controlling the movement, there's lots of different ways to control the movement of a photograph. In this particular case, we're not actually controlling the movement of the subject, we're controlling the movement of our viewer's eyes. And in this case, this is what I would consider not a successful photograph here. It's fine, it's close to exposed properly, but all of the interest is over here in this quadrant, and it's all leading out. It's all pointing out. And so it's moving the viewer away from the picture, and not in a pleasing way. It's got all this unbalance over here, and it just doesn't fill the frame properly. Now here's a similar picture with another. You can see it's got some elements that are very similar. This has got another flower that's leading out, but it's balanced over here with flowers on the left-hand side that are working in this quadrant, and they're also they're pulling the viewer back in. So the viewer is being let out, but also pulled back in, and that's a great way to fill a frame and keep the viewer's eyes moving around the frame properly. Here's another example of just controlling the movement. I don't know what these little leaves are. They're adorable to me. They look like butterflies to me, so I had to photograph them. But I photographed it in such a way that this little guy is flying into the frame. And not only that, if you look, the boardwalk underneath is creating interesting diagonal lines that are also working with this shape to move the eye this way. And so this is a great way to control the movement, and it just creates a more interesting, more pleasing composition for the viewer. So let's move on to another way to add easy interest, and that is through the use of color. Now, this might be one of the more obvious ones, but it's something to keep in mind when you're looking for great compositions. This is a great simple example of this, actually. These are just weeds. But popping against this green and yellow, we have one little pool of purple. And actually, if you keep looking at it long enough, there's a couple little other dots of purple back there. But it adds a real interest instantly. And same thing here, we have real muddy, grungy looking browns and blacks, and then a little pop of color. And here, and here. Even against this black water, these little wild azaleas just add a lot of interest. So look for color. Just look for pools of color and something that just is unexpected, and this can really add a lot to your photographs. And you know what else adds a lot to your photographs is getting in closer. So let's talk about getting closer. This is going to talk a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about storytelling here, because this is a photograph I took with my iPhone last week at a Renaissance fair, and it's a snapshot. This doesn't really tell any stories. It has some leading lines, but basically it's a snapshot. But when you get a little closer into the Renaissance fair, you could take really interesting photographs. And to me, this little frame tells a whole story. You have this blacksmith's weathered hands. You have all of his equipment here. You even have his modern boots and modern socks and little pins. And I feel like this just tells more of a story than this. This is a snapshot, and this is a story. Here's another example of it. This is the aesthetics program at my college. Here's a real basic snapshot, but here is close-ups of what's happening there, and this is just much more interesting. It's great texture, it's great interest, it draws you into the frame. This is a nice shape here leading in and up and out. And this can also be done with food even. You know, this is an okay picture, it's not bad, but getting in closer you get a lot more interest, a lot more detail, and it just draws you in. The other thing we can do is to create depth. We're going to go back to this picture of the Renaissance Fair again and look and see this is a photograph that even though you can tell there's stuff in the background and some stuff in the foreground, it doesn't feel like a very dynamic photograph. And the same thing over here with this forest photograph. Okay, it's a forest, but it looks very flat, and there's no element that seems any more important or interesting than any other element. So your eye does not know where to go. Same exact scene, just getting a little closer and getting it down lower, and now we've created an interesting foreground here with some detail of the fern, some of the shadow falling on the fern down here to create some balance. And this is a more deep and more interesting composition to me. Same as this. I mean, this has a lot of foreground elements, a lot of mid, and then background elements, and it pulls you right into it. And so to me, this is a successful photograph because it pulls you right from the foreground all the way into the back. And now we're going to talk very briefly about light, because light is something that I could definitely talk about for hours, and we're not going to get into all that. So we're just going to talk a little bit about light and about finding great and dramatic light, and basically how to create some drama and interest in your photographs. So this light here, this is a diffused and reflected light. It means it's bouncing, it's coming through some leaves from the trees on the other side, and it's also bouncing. And so this is a really nice soft light. This is great for photographing people because it creates nice, flattering, low shadows, and very, very forgiving for any of us that might have any flaws in our skin. However, for photographing nature, it may not be the most interesting way to photograph it. This is a little bit more dramatic light. You can see a little bit more detail. It's not really much, it's not sharper, it's just got a little bit more detail. However, it's too harsh. It's got some really direct light on these leaves back here, which is just blowing them out, and I don't enjoy that. To me, this is my favorite way of photographing things that have some translucence. It creates a lot of drama. You can see a lot of detail. You can really get a better picture of what the structure of this leaf is, and I just think it's a more interesting photograph than the other one. Keep losing my place. And here's another example of using that diffused light from behind. These little flowers down here, they're so delicate and they're so small. I really wanted to be able to highlight them, but they were kind of just disappearing. And so I found that the best way to highlight them was to actually get them lit from behind and then make sure that they fell against a darker background so that they would really pop out. And here's another example of just light from behind that's really just making this look like a drama show. And you know what, while we're on light, the other aspect of looking for light is to look for shadows. And this is one of the ways to make your photographs most dramatic, is to look for great shadows. In fact, this entire image is all about reflective light and shadows. And you can see this is reflected from this tree. Of course, this upside down stuff is just because it's on the water. But this pool down here of real great contrast just comes from this great shadow that's down here. And even the lines created are made from shadow. And so looking for shadow is just as important as looking for light. You know what? The other thing that creates a lot of interest in drama is leading lines. Now, leading lines are what allow your viewer to know what you want them to look at and where you want them to look in the frame. Now, this is an obvious example because look, you just can't help but to follow the stairs all the way down to this little fairy pond here in the bottom. But it doesn't always have to be quite this obvious. I mean, here's an example of all this drama. It's all leading towards the middle, and all these lines are pointing in the same direction. They're all telling the same story. They're all saying, look back here. And it creates depth, because here's a foreground and a background, but it also creates just a lot of visual pop. And sometimes leading lines are really subtle. So this is another example of leading lines, but boy, it is so subtle, but it starts down here, and if you follow, there's a whole path that's going all the way from the bottom down here all the way out of the frame. And it just creates, it gives the viewer's eye somewhere to look, and it tells them what you want them to see. And viewers need that. Viewers want you to help them understand what they're supposed to be looking at. Now, another way that we can create a lot of interest is using negative space. I'm going to go back to one of the pictures at the beginning, and we're going to talk a little bit about negative space here. So this all may seem like wasted space up here, but all this space up here creates a lot of interest for this little area right here, which is actually, I really want my viewer looking here, but it balances out with all this up here. And this is another example of this. So without all this negative space around these branches, you wouldn't really see all of the interesting shapes and colors and movement in this branch. So finding the sky to photograph this against is much more impactful than photographing this against a busy background. And the same way, the negative space does not have to be blank like this. Negative space can also just be something that's not as interesting as the interest point. I love this little, I don't know why this little curly-Q pine straw happened, but I loved it just like that. So I decided to create it in the corner down here. This is in the quadrants. And just, it created some interest back here. And then one of the last things I want to talk about is just texture. If I love anything in photography more than light, it might be texture. I'm just very drawn to capturing texture. I think it's so interesting, and people don't photograph texture quite as much as I think they should. There's beautiful textures all around us all the time, and if you don't think there's something to photograph, even in the room you're in right now, I guarantee there's some interesting texture with either some pattern to it, with some cool colors. And even this is just a concrete wall on a walk I always take. A lot of times nature creates fantastic texture. This is the floor of a garage where things get spotted all the time. This can apply to anywhere you look. There's always fantastic textures. And nothing really says more about your world to me than what textures surround you. To me, this tells a whole different story about where you might be in the world than this, or this, or this, or this. So using texture to tell the story, it may not be the only photograph you want to take, but if you add some texture to your photographs, then you're going to immediately draw people in. You're going to make them feel like they're really there with you in the scene. So these are our 10 rules for today. We're going to talk about, we've talked about changing our position, the rule of thirds, controlling the movement of the viewer, the color, getting closer for detail, creating depth, looking at light, leading lines, looking for negative space, and texture. Now, I would love for you to photograph some things and send them to me. And so if you want to, my email address is right here, carrienmoultrie@gmail.com. And I would love to see what you create. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you've learned a lot. Thank you.